My parents chose to travel over me. Then Mom wanted my help when Dad left her for a waitress. I never thought I'd be kicked out at 18, but here I am, telling my story 5 years later. Looking back at my childhood, it was pretty clear that my parents weren't interested in being parents. My dad worked as a car mechanic, and my mom was a bank teller. They were great with other people, but treated me like I was invisible in our own house. By the time I reached high school, I had given up trying to get their attention. It wasn't always like this. When I was younger, I used to try everything to make them notice me. I'd bring home good grades, help with house chores without being asked, and even tried learning about cars so I could talk to my dad about his work. But nothing worked. They'd just nod or give short answers before going back to whatever they were doing. We lived like strangers under the same roof. I would stay in my room, they would stay in theirs, and we'd only talk if we absolutely had to. Our house was big enough that we could go days without seeing each other. My dad would come home late from the garage, covered in grease and tired. My mom would return from the bank around the same time I got back from school, but she'd go straight to her room and close the door. I didn't like it, but I had accepted that this was how things were going to be. Some days, I would sit in my room and listen to them talking and laughing downstairs. They weren't bad people, they just didn't want to be parents. I'd hear them making plans for vacations they never took me on, or discussing their day at work. But whenever I walked into the room, the conversation would stop, and they'd find reasons to leave. On my 18th birthday, they didn't even try to be subtle about it. I came down for breakfast, and instead of a birthday cake or presents, they had prepared a speech. "You're an adult now," they said. "We've done our legal duty. It's time for you to make your own way." They said it like they were doing me a favor, teaching me about independence. But I knew what it really meant. They were finally free of their unwanted responsibility. I hadn't applied to any colleges because I knew I needed to save money first. My parents had made it clear they wouldn't help with tuition, and I didn't want to drown in student loans. I got a job at a local hardware store, thinking I could work for a year and then maybe start community college. The pay wasn't great, but it was something. I started in the lumber department, helping customers load wood into their trucks and organizing inventory. But 2 weeks after I started working, my parents dropped a bomb on me. They were selling the house. They had apparently been saving money for years to buy an RV and travel across the country. Now that I was 18 and had a job, they said they were finally free to do what they wanted. They had already contacted a real estate agent and were planning to list the house within the month. I tried explaining that I had just started working and couldn't afford rent anywhere yet. Entry-level hardware store jobs don't exactly pay enough to cover apartment deposits and monthly rent. I asked them to wait a few months so I could save up some money. Their response: "That's your problem, not ours. The house is our property, and we can do whatever we want with it." My mom even added, "We've been waiting for this moment for years. We're not putting our lives on hold anymore." I lost it that day. All the hurt and anger from years of being ignored came pouring out. I screamed at them, told them they were horrible people, and that I hoped they would be as miserable as they had made me. I grabbed what I could fit in my backpack and stormed out. But reality hit me hard when I realized I had nowhere to go. We lived in a different state from all our relatives, and my parents had never bothered to keep in touch with family. They hadn't attended weddings, graduations, or family reunions. I didn't even know most of my cousins' names. The few times relatives had tried to visit us, my parents had made excuses about being too busy. My school friends were all away at college, and I didn't want to burden their families with my problems. That's when I thought about my coworker at the hardware store. She worked in the paint department, and we had become good friends in the short time I'd been there. She was 2 years older than me and had her own story of family troubles. Her dad was in and out of rehab, and her mom had abandoned them both when she was young. She had been on her own since 18, working to save money for trade school. We would often talk during lunch breaks, sharing stories about our dysfunctional families and our dreams for the future. She wanted to become a professional makeup artist, and I admired how determined she was. Despite everything life had thrown at her, she kept pushing forward, saving every extra dollar she could for her cosmetology courses. When I called her that evening and explained my situation, she didn't hesitate. "Come over right now," she said. "You can stay with me." I'll never forget that moment. Her tiny one-bedroom apartment became my safe haven. It was on the 3rd floor of an old building, with creaky floors and temperamental heating, but it felt more like home than my parents' house ever did. For the first few months, she wouldn't even let me pay rent, just asking me to chip in for groceries and utilities when I could. She said she knew what it was like to start from nothing, and she wanted to help me get on my feet. We would cook dinner together, share the small living space, and talk about our days. It was strange at first, living with someone who actually wanted me around. What started as friendship turned into something more. We understood each other in a way that's hard to explain. Both of us knew what it felt like to be unwanted by our own parents, and we found comfort in supporting each other. While I had planned to work at the hardware store for just a year, life had other plans. I worked harder than ever, taking extra shifts and learning everything I could about the business. Within a year, I was promoted to floor manager. My girlfriend, who later became my wife, finally started her cosmetology courses while keeping her part-time job at the store. We were doing okay, building our life together. The apartment didn't feel so small anymore. It felt like our own little world. We had our routines, our inside jokes, and our shared dreams. I hadn't heard from my parents in all this time, and honestly, I preferred it that way. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. 5 years after I left home, my mom showed up at our door unannounced. I made the mistake of opening the door without checking who it was, and suddenly she was hugging me and crying. Before I could process what was happening, she was already putting her bags down in our apartment. The life I had carefully built was about to be shaken to its core, and I had no idea how to handle what was coming next. My mom stood in our living room, her bags at her feet, looking older than I remembered. 5 years had changed her. Her hair had more gray, and her face showed signs of stress I'd never seen before. But what really caught my attention was how lost she looked. Nothing like the confident woman who had dismissed me from her life years ago. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to throw her out immediately, but another part was frozen in shock. My wife was at work, and I found myself wishing she was there to help me handle this situation. Before I could say anything, my mom started talking. "Your father is leaving me," she said, her voice breaking. "He's having an affair with a waitress at his favorite diner." She went on to explain how they had spent the first 2 years traveling in their RV, visiting every state they'd dreamed about. Then they had settled in Arizona, where my dad found work at another garage and my mom got a part-time job at a local store. She kept talking, tears running down her face, explaining how she discovered the affair. How my dad had been acting strange for months, coming home late, being secretive with his phone. Then one day, he simply told her he was in love with someone else and wanted to start a new life. "I have nowhere else to go," she said, looking at me with pleading eyes. "I need a place to stay while I figure out the divorce. I don't have much savings left." She spoke as if it was the most natural thing in the world for her to come to me for help, as if she hadn't abandoned me 5 years ago. I let out a laugh that surprised even me. "You need my help?" I asked. "Let me remind you of something you once said to me." I cleared my throat and repeated her exact words from 5 years ago. "You're an adult now, and we don't need to take responsibility for what you do anymore. This is our property, and we can do whatever we want with it." The look on her face was priceless. She stepped back as if I'd slapped her, her mouth opening and closing without words coming out. "But I'm your mother," she finally managed to say. "No," I replied. "You stopped being my mother the day you chose your RV dreams over your teenage son. This is my home, and I can do whatever I want with it, including not letting you stay here." I opened the door and gestured for her to leave. She picked up her bags, still crying, and walked out. I closed the door behind her and sat down on our couch, my hands shaking. When my wife came home that evening and I told her what happened, she was quiet for a long time. "Maybe you should give her a chance," she finally said. "I know she hurt you, but she's still your mother." I could tell she was thinking about her own parents, her dad who had died from an overdose last year, and her mom who she never got to reconcile with before a heart attack took her. But this was different. My mother had made her choice 5 years ago. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was just looking for a place to stay because her plans had fallen apart. The next day, I saw her at the hardware store, wandering the aisles and giving me sad looks. She stayed for over an hour, just walking around and sighing loudly whenever she passed near me. This went on for a week. She would show up at the store, walk around, and try to catch my eye. My coworkers started asking questions, and I had to explain that yes, that was my mother, and no, I didn't want to talk to her. Some of them thought I was being too harsh, but they hadn't lived my life. After a week of this, she changed tactics. She started posting on social media about how cruel her son was, how I was just like my father, abandoning her when she needed help. She somehow found my wife's social media accounts and started tagging her too, trying to guilt her into convincing me to change my mind. I don't know how she found all this information about us. Our social media accounts were private, and I hadn't spoken to any relatives in years. Later, I found out she had found an old Facebook account of mine that I'd forgotten about. It was still public, with pictures of our apartment building and tags of my friends. My wife was understanding through all of this, but I could tell it was affecting her. She had lost both her parents recently, and watching this drama with my mother was bringing up painful memories for her. We talked about it one night, after another day of my mother's social media attacks. "I know why you don't want to help her," my wife said, "and I support whatever decision you make. I just don't want you to regret anything later." She was right. She always is about these things. But I couldn't bring myself to help my mother, not after everything. The situation reached its peak when my mother started waiting by my car after work. One evening, I found her leaning against my car, looking worse than ever. Her clothes were wrinkled, and she had dark circles under her eyes. When she saw me, she started crying again, but this time it wasn't the dramatic crying from before. These were quiet tears, the kind that come when you've got nothing left. I felt a twinge of guilt, watching her cry in the parking lot. Not because I owed her anything, but because I'm human, and seeing another human in pain isn't easy. I told her to get in the car so we could talk properly. She told me she had been staying at a cheap motel outside town, using money borrowed from old friends. She had no job, no savings, and no real plan. She had quit her job years ago when they started traveling, and now she had nothing to fall back on. All her friends from before had moved on with their lives, and those who remembered her weren't interested in helping after years of being ignored. I listened to everything she had to say, then told her the most I could do was give her some money to help with expenses. But you can't stay here, I said firmly. I don't trust you, and I don't want you in my life. She got angry then, telling me she didn't want my help anyway. She got out of the car, slammed the door hard enough to shake the whole car, and walked away. That was the last time I saw her for a while. A month passed without any sign of my mother. The social media posts stopped, she wasn't at the store anymore, and life started getting back to normal. I heard through some old family friends that she had been staying at a motel outside town, but even they lost track of her after she blocked them all on social media. My wife and I focused on our lives. She was doing well in her cosmetology courses, and I had settled into my role as floor manager at the store. We had our routine, morning coffee together, work, dinner at home, weekend movies. It was simple, but it was ours. Then, almost a year after my mother's dramatic appearance, I got invited to my cousin's wedding. I hadn't planned on going, but my wife thought it might be good to reconnect with some family. You don't have to stay long, she said, but it might be nice to see everyone. At the wedding, I heard something interesting from my aunts. Apparently, my parents were back together. I couldn't believe it at first. My mother had seemed so broken up about my father's affair. I had to know more, so I did something I never thought I'd do. I asked for family gossip. My aunts were more than happy to fill me in. After my mother left, she had given my father an ultimatum. Either file for divorce or she would do it herself and take him for everything she could get. But here's where it gets funny. When my father went to talk to the waitress about marriage, he found out he wasn't special at all. She had been seeing other men too, and she had no interest in settling down with him. My father, realizing what an idiot he'd been, went back to my mother. They worked things out, and now they were traveling again in their RV like nothing had happened. They didn't come to the wedding. Of course, they were still the same people who never showed up for family events. When I told my wife this story later, we both laughed. It seemed fitting somehow. My parents deserved each other. They had both walked away from their responsibilities when things got tough, and now they were stuck with each other. Looking back at everything now, I realize how much my life has changed in these 5 years. When my parents kicked me out, I thought my life was over. I was scared, angry, and felt completely alone. But that moment led me to where I am now, married to someone who actually cares about me, working a steady job, and building a life I'm proud of. Sometimes I wonder if my parents ever think about me, if they regret what they did. But honestly, it doesn't matter anymore. I've learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about who sticks around when things get tough. My wife taught me that. She took me in when I had nothing, believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, and helped me build a real home. The hardware store where we both work isn't just a job anymore. It's where our story started. My wife is almost done with her cosmetology courses, and I'm thinking about taking some business classes at the community college. We're talking about buying a house someday, maybe starting our own family. Last week, I saw an RV that looked like my parents parked at a gas station. I don't know if it was really them, and I didn't stick around to find out. I just drove past, thinking about how different my life would have been if they had been different people. But then I wouldn't be who I am now, and I wouldn't have the life I have. I used to think being unwanted by your parents was the worst thing that could happen to someone. Now I know better. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead us to the best places. My parents taught me exactly what kind of person I don't want to be, and that's worth something too. My wife and I still live in that same apartment where she took me in 5 years ago. The floors still creak, the heating still acts up sometimes, but it's home. We've filled it with our own memories, our own love, our own kind of family. And maybe that's the best revenge, building a happy life despite everything they did. People at the wedding asked if I'd ever forgive my parents. I told them I already have, not because they deserve it, but because holding on to that anger wasn't doing me any good. Forgiveness doesn't mean letting them back into my life, though. It just means I've accepted that they are who they are, and I'm better off without them. My wife and I talk sometimes about what we'll do differently when we have kids. We make promises about being present, being supportive, being the kind of parents we wished we had. And I know we'll keep those promises because we both know how it feels to be unwanted. Sometimes the best parents are the ones who know exactly what not to do. The family gossip says my parents have become a joke among the relatives. People laugh about how they ended up right back where they started after all their big plans. But I don't laugh anymore. I just feel grateful that their selfish decisions led me to build a better life for myself. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that you can't choose your parents, but you can choose what kind of person you become despite them. Every day, I choose to be better than they were. Every day, I choose to be someone who keeps their promises, who shows up for the people they love, who builds a home instead of running away from it. And that's really the end of this story. Not with some big dramatic confrontation or tearful reunion, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing I built something good out of something bad. My parents are still out there somewhere in their RV, living the life they always wanted. And I'm here, living the life I never knew I could have, and that's more than enough for me.